Those native societies didn't maintain their sovereignty and their independence. They're going to encounter strangers from Europe, and the Europeans are going to have certain things going for them that allow them to, in some broad sense, wipe out or suppress every native society they run into, and it's going to happen very, very quickly. So somehow or other, certain European nations are going to find themselves penetrating into the Western Hemisphere and then establishing huge empires that affect the world today. How's that happen? Okay, now I'm here to tell you that Europe, certain European nations, are largely starting in the 1400s, but then clearly in the 1500s, are going to leap into this area here and take over huge tracts of territory and set up colonies. It's going to be European nations that do it. And so, as a matter of common sense, if you were going to ask yourself questions like about this, why did certain nations, some of the nations are going to be nations like Spain and Portugal, why did those nations wind up taking the lead and leaping into the Western Hemisphere? How come Spanish, for example, is so deeply embedded in the culture of a vast continent when it didn't used to be there 500 years ago? Why those nations in particular? Well, it would be easy enough to say, well, European nations went into the Western Hemisphere because Europe was strong, Europe was advanced, they were looking for conquest and looking for lands to colonize, and Europe was on top. There was like a victim waiting to be taken over. So, and you know what? None of that's even true. From my perspective, that the opposite is true. Certain European nations, not the richest, not the most advanced, they are the ones who are going to take the lead in going into the Western Hemisphere, and they'll change history. They didn't know they were going to do it, but that's what happens. And they do it, those countries that do it, like Spain and Portugal, they're doing it not because they're strong, but because in some sense they're backward and relatively weak compared to the real top dogs, and so they were willing to experiment and take risks. That's my whole theory. Europe is going to launch the so-called age of exploration, because that's what historians call it. You know, the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere didn't need to be explored or be discovered. They knew they were there. But the historians have decided to call the 1400s and the 1500s the age of exploration. It's Europe that takes the lead. Why? I'm saying not because it was strong, because it was weak. So let me continue. Before the age of exploration, the early 1400s, before Christopher Columbus before Christopher Columbus existed, early 1400s, what was the strongest and most advanced nation on earth? Well, I'll tell you what. If a visitor from space with high intelligence came to the globe, claimed to planet Earth in 1410, and for some incredible reason managed to find a human being who actually knew something about all the continents, and the spaceman says to the guy, take me to your leader. Take me to the society that's most advanced, where the human race has reached its highest level of potential in terms of wealth, organization, cultural expression, artistic achievement. Take me to that place. Where is it? And the all-knowing human would say, I'll tell you where to go. Go right there. Go to China. For a whole bunch of the era of civilization, China was by far the most advanced place on earth. Not Europe at all. How is that possible? Well, listen, China managed to consolidate itself into a single empire led by an emperor, one government in charge of 60, 70, maybe even 100 million people very early on, way ahead of the rest of most places on earth. Europe remained very fragmented and busted up into hostile factions until the 1800s in some sense. Ain't no doubt about it. If you wanted to find the place with the greatest wealth, the largest armies, the highest technology, China would be the place. And then secondarily, the Muslim empires that had come together since the time of Muhammad, through the 800s and the 900s and the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, they were highly, highly wealthy and sophisticated, centers of learning and science. The Ottoman Empire, today surrounds essentially Turkey. The Safavids is the empire that coincides with Iran today. Any one of these empires was significantly stronger and more sophisticated than anything happening in Europe in the 1400s. And then lastly, I'll say the Mughals, also Muslims, had established themselves in what is essentially Pakistan today. And they had a very high and elaborate civilization. So all of these places were ahead of Europe in the 1400s. Europe, in some sense, was still trying to recover from the Dark Ages and the collapse of the Roman Empire. It was growing, cities coming back, recovering from the Black Plague, but still backward. So there's a quick illustration. Why is Europe relatively weak compared to China? Because it's all busted up into little tiny segments. The Holy Roman Empire looks like it's one great big thing. It wasn't. It was a whole bunch of different cities, well, a whole bunch of different entities like Saxony and Bavaria, each with its own prince. Little tiny countries, small populations. Therefore, it has to have a small army, small tax base, as opposed to the great big Eastern empires where you have a huge chunk of people under the thumb of the government, and the government's able to squeeze money out of them. Yes. And then that money they squeeze out through labor and the agricultural produce supports a great big bureaucracy and army. Yes, that's why that model of the empire worked for and kept, in some sense, the Middle East and Asia ahead of Western Europe through the time we're talking about. So you could ask yourself, if it's the strongest nation that begins the age of exploration, how come China didn't do it? Because they didn't need to. China was totally focused on its own internal dynamics. In fact, they did send out, it's understood now that there was a great Chinese kind of ocean-going convoy that did a lot of exploring, but ultimately nothing came out of it. The Chinese historically believed they were the center of the universe. The celestial people, the center of the universe, they didn't need to explore. They had it all. So it's not going to be the Chinese that bust into the Western Hemisphere. Well, who's going to bust into the Western Hemisphere? It's going to be Europeans, and they're going to be driven by economic factors. You remember the Europeans don't even know that there's a Western Hemisphere out there. They don't know that. So it's not going to be the things that motivate certain European nations to start to explore. It's not going to be the desire to spread Christianity to foreign lands. They don't know there are any foreign lands out there. There might be some desire to spread Christianity to Asia. Asian ones know it to exist. But the big thing is an economic connection. The higher classes of Europe, the nobles, the landowning nobles, larger number of merchants who wanted to live better. People who have money typically want to live better. They don't want to eat. They don't want to live at the lowest level of a peasant, dirt-eating peasants. They want the better things in life. And so there's a growing population of those folks in the 1400s, merchants and nobles, people with some money, and they wanted to buy the good stuff. And good stuff at that time would be things like this: finest clothing, jewelry, drugs and dyes, but especially spices. On an everyday basis, spices. So I'm telling you, the wealthier classes of Europe had a high desire to get exotic spices. And by exotic aromatic spices, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things that are not native to Western Europe. So what's that? There's a fiery, powerful spice. What is it? That's black pepper. And those are cloves. I'm here to tell you. Some of you don't cook with cloves. You put some cloves in something, you'll taste it for the rest of your life. Now, what's that? That's cinnamon. And that's nutmeg. That's what the nutmeg looks like, my friends. Mm-hmm. None of those things are native to Europe. And there was a high demand for exotic spices because these people were in a position to eat better. That is, not just eat mush all the time, but eat meat, eat game and fowl and pork and beef on occasion. All of the stuff they ate was rotting. A lot of their food was putrid. And so to disguise that taste, they wanted to fire it up. So collectively, this represented a huge demand and a great big profitable industry that had taken, that developed over many, many centuries, back to the time of the Romans as far as that goes. Trade routes out to where the good stuff was had been established. And where was the good stuff? Way out here. The spice in particular is coming from what they call the Spice Islands, also the Moluccas. Today that's Indonesia. A lot of excellent stuff was coming from India in terms of fine craftsmanship, spices, and China was a place with the best ceramics, silks, and so forth. Europe didn't produce anything as high quality as that, and they had a strong hankering for it. These places didn't, there's basically nothing Europe was producing in the 1400s these guys wanted, so these guys had to pay cash for it. And over the generations, an overland trade routes. One is called the Silk Road that still takes you through the Middle East, through Armenia, across portions of Russia and Iran, deep, deep into China. It's still there. These trade routes got established. And so by the 1400s, they're long established and highly lucrative, money-making commerce involved in getting the good stuff from these zones to Europe. Now, who controlled that spice trade? Well, the overland portion was very much in the hands of Muslim traders. Arabs, Iranians, Turks, they controlled a central choke point about where these overland trade routes went. You've heard of the name Marco Polo. The Polo brothers went from Italy across these routes in the 1200s. That's how long ago we're talking about. So Muslims had a lock on the actual acquiring the goods and taking them across to deliver them to Europe. Then who picked it up? Well, in the fullness of time, 2 city-states had pretty much established a monopoly over getting the good stuff into the Mediterranean and then distributing it. So Muslim traders handed off the goods to the traders from Genoa and Venice. So I'm here to tell you, in the 1400s, if you ask somebody, what's the richest and most advanced society in Europe, you'd have to say Venice and Genoa in particular, the Venetian Republic and the Genovese Republic, city-states. See, Italy wasn't a unified nation at that time. It was busted up into a much smaller entities, very often city-states, where one city with the farmland surrounding it, acting separately. In these cases, these 2 little tiny areas had powerful armies, a lot of money to hire mercenaries. They were the fastest acting, most nimble and aggressive traders in Europe. And the money was pouring into them. All the other countries in Europe wanted to get access to that good stuff, the tremendous wealth of the Far Eastern trade, but they really couldn't knock out of the way the Italians. And so, again, I'm kind of going back to the question, if it's the strongest nations that begin to explore, how come it wasn't the Italians? How come Italian wasn't the language that's deeply rooted in the Western Hemisphere? Well, as a matter of fact, a bunch of Italians did do the exploring. But ultimately, they're not going to be the ones. Venice and Genoa didn't mess around with long-distance exploration. They had a lock on the best deal in town. All right. I'm trying to explain to you how one particular country is going to wind up financing an expedition that results in the discovery, in effect, the discovery of the New World by Europe, a particular country in Europe, and that starts a whole chain of events that changes the history of humanity flat out. And the last thing I was trying to explain to you was how come the most advanced and powerful nations on Earth, in position number 1, didn't do the exploring, and in fact, it's the countries that were not number 1, but the countries kind of behind the pack, seeking to break into some good stuff. They're the ones who did the exploring. The Chinese, being number 1, they do not encounter and exploit the New World. The Italians, being on top of the best economic deal in Europe, they are not the ones whose individual city-states send out expeditions that result in the discovery of the New World. If that had been the case, well, who knows what would have happened to the Republic of Venice? Would that have turned it into some kind of global empire? which it didn't become. It remained a little city-state, and then was eventually absorbed much, much later into the united nation of Italy. None of those things happened. Those nations that were leading the pack didn't need to do that exploration. So I finally got to this. What country did begin the age of exploration? I told you, it is the countries that were behind the pack and eager to break into that extremely profitable trade. They didn't have access, easy access to that stuff. And when a country is able to get access to that stuff, it creates national wealth. It creates power. You all can understand that. So you'll know the answer to this question. One nation in particular started the process of European nations sending out trade expeditions or exploratory expeditions into the ocean, looking for faraway sources of wealth. One nation did it. In effect, one nation begins the age of exploration. That's what this is called, the age of exploration. And what is the name of that nation? Do you know? Some of this room's got to know. What is it? It is Portugal. It's not Spain. The Portuguese will start this process in the 1430s. And then Spain will see, other nations will see their success. Other nations will not be especially impressed by it, but sooner or later, circumstances will come together and the Spanish will follow suit. It'll take them a couple of generations to decide to do that. But yeah, one answer to a question is simply that Portugal, that little tiny, Portugal is the size of a flea, ladies and gentlemen. In various times, obviously, Portugal is a little tiny segment of what is called the Iberian Peninsula. This is the Iberian Peninsula. That's what the Romans called it. And the Portuguese speak Portuguese. In Portugal, they speak Portuguese, which is an offshoot of Latin. The Spanish speak Spanish, which is an offshoot of Latin. Portuguese is very distinct from Spanish. So in that little tiny piece of territory, two different language groups evolved out of Latin. There are a bunch of people of Portuguese descent in the San Joaquin Valley, involved in all kinds of activities, agriculture in particular. And they're very proud of being Portuguese. Portuguese is a little tiny country. It's minuscule. At various times taken over by Spain. It's kind of amazing that it's maintained its independence, but it has. And then, as I say, Spain is going to follow suit. It takes a long time, but these two are going to get out ahead of the pack. And I told you they did this. Why do they have the motivation to do it? Because they were not in front. They were behind, and they were eager to break into this profitable trade. And I'll give you some more reasons very quickly, too. Yes, they're losers in the sense that they weren't number one. They're also, when I say geography, they're stuck way out in the Atlantic, way, way, way out there. They're basically surrounded by water. So they have a deep-seated tradition of seafaring. And here's the key thing, is that Portugal came under the leadership of a particularly, aggressive leader. It wasn't divided by a civil war. It wasn't divided into a bunch of little principalities. One ruler established control over it. One royal house established control over it. Prince Henry the Navigator came into power, and he has this title. He's given this title. He was eagerly interested in creating an academy to train seamen how to engage in seafaring expeditions. So he's going to finance this. It's going to be pushed by the government. It's being pushed by the government in order to promote national wealth. And so, as I say, soon enough the Spanish will follow, and they have the same advantage. They stuck way. It's a seafaring nation with a long tradition going back to ancient times and knowing how to engage in sea voyages. And they came under the leadership. They too will come under unified leadership. When Isabella of Castile y Leon marries Ferdinand of Aragon, Spain, like many other parts of Europe, had been divided up into rival little noble estates and kingdoms and domains. This is the result of the period of feudalism, the time of knights in armor and all that stuff. Spain did not become a unified nation for a long, long, long time. But when these two royal houses came together, this is what they brought together. She, in effect, was the ruler of Castile. This is the English version, Castile, which means castle. He is the leader of this Aragon. When they bring this together, can you see how they brought together most of Spain? And they together began this process of driving out the Muslims. Muslims had invaded the Iberian Peninsula coming across from Africa hundreds of years earlier. They were there for 700 years. Knocking on the doorstep this direction into France, knocking on the doorstep of the rest of Europe. These two systematically drove them out and drove out the Jewish people too, forced them to convert to Catholicism. All of this is famous in the history of Spain. But they provided leadership, and they want to make money for their estate. So that's why they'll get into the picture. And I'll also quickly say that these two nations had inherited all the know-how about long-distance sea voyages that had developed over the ages. And then that's the one area in which Europe had an advantage over China, either Asian civilizations or Muslim civilizations. All of those places knew how to engage in sea voyages for sure. They had versions of ships, but the Europeans had pulled together, on the whole, the most effective designs of ships. Sturdy, sails, steering systems, a little bit of navigation. At that time, this is an astrolabe. They had the ability to calculate where they were north and south, that's all. When it went to going east and west, they were at a loss. And it takes humanity a long time to figure that out. How do we track where we are east and west? So, the Portuguese are going to start this. What do? Does Prince Henry the Navigator begin the process of sending voyages way out into the Atlantic? Is that what he does? And the answer is no. That's right. That doesn't surprise you. That shouldn't surprise anybody. He sticks close to home. The Portuguese are going to begin their process of exploring down the African coast. It passed areas where the European world was familiar. Now listen, you may not know this, but back into ancient times, in the times of the Roman Empire, the Romans were familiar with Africa. I mean, this is the home of ancient kingdoms like Carthage. The Romans had conquered this whole area and established fantastic cities in this zone right here. And you can go see the ruins of the Romans in Libya, for example. So the Romans were very familiar with this zone right here, but not deep down into past the Sahara. And that's where the Portuguese gradually inched down. And look how long it took them. And they're going to start to engage in trade with these African tribes, and they're going to find some good stuff. They're going to find some stuff they want. They're going to find some gold. They're going to find some spices. They're going to find some slaves. And this is when the trade in African slaves begins, as some African kingdoms take their hostages and enemies and sell them off for money. That's the beginning of that, the 1400s. And Portugal is in cahoots with the various tribes down here. Finally, after all of these years, after 50 to 60 years, Portuguese make it to the Cape of Good Hope. By 1486, they make it to Cape Horn. And that means they don't know it, but they're on the tip of the African continent, which is an enormous continent. Then they round the tip and they get into the Indian Ocean, and they're on their way to India. And then they sure as hell found an alternative route to the exotic goods of the Far East, or at least in this case, South Asia. So the Portuguese had a good deal, and they work it, and they work it, and they work it. They're not going to go way out. So they had the second best deal in town. And they are not going to send out voyages far into the Atlantic. That's how we finally get to, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You've got a good thing going. That's how we finally get to Columbus in Spain. There is one attempt to imagine what Columbus looked like. There's another. I'm not going to ask a question about his background. It's a funny thing to contemplate that nobody knows what Christopher Columbus really looked like, and I really don't care about him as an individual. But you'll see what I mean in a moment. I'll give you some things about his background because they help explain why he did what he did. He's from Genoa. It means he's from that little city-state, very powerful, important city-state, with a seafaring tradition. He comes from a modest background. He was not from a noble family. So he had to make a living. He got involved in commerce, and the bottom line is his life led him into involvement with seaborne commerce. Seaborne commerce. So he's not, again, not from nobility, has to work for a living. And his life experience gave him some knowledge about map making, the ability to read a map, long distance sea voyages, all that stuff. He also must have been incredibly ambitious. He was literate. He obviously developed enough ambition. He was highly religious as well, but he obviously developed enough ambition to develop a scheme, which he didn't invent out of nothing, but was kind of influenced by all of his experience with seaborne commerce. And then he had enough confidence to try to sell that idea to various governments. So he had developed a proposal. He essentially was an independent contractor trying to find a governmental sponsor for an expedition which was promising a big return, access to the riches of the Far East. I'll tell you what that is in a moment. He had this idea. He tried to contact the royal house of France, the leadership of France. He tried to approach the leadership of England. Both of those countries were preoccupied with other things. He tried to approach the royal house, Ferdinand and Isabella. They shunned him initially, but he pestered them and pestered them and pestered them. And finally, almost apparently just about as an afterthought, they are going to fund a low-budget expedition for that guy. They'll outfit him with some ships. And all of this is done because this guy is offering them a kind of far-fetched opportunity to make some money, get into the Asian spice trade, and increase the wealth of their kingdom. That's what it's all about. And it wasn't a high priority. They were much more concerned about what they knew about in the political events of Europe. They give this guy some dough. And they outfit him with 3 crummy little ships, and a kind of a ragtag crew, 90 men total. And what are the names of those ships? Everybody's supposed to know this. It's a childhood rhyme. What's the name of it? That's a Niña la Pinta en la Santa Maria. So this is not a high class, high dollar expedition. It is cut rate. And now, ultimately, Columbus becomes a world historical person, not during his own lifetime. His name should be known to every civilized person, whether he deserves it or not. And over the past couple of 100 years, the general public has come to associate him with some brand new ideas. And here are some of those ideas. Here they are. He did accept the idea and put forward the notion that the world was a globe. And some people attribute that as attribute to him the origination of that idea, and that's not true. He didn't invent that idea. He inherited that idea. That idea had been around since ancient times. The ancient Greeks, 200 years before the birth of Christ, assumed that the earth was a globe like the other heavens, and they were able to use geometry to calculate very closely to true the circumference of the earth. So that wasn't new, but ordinary people like you and me would assume that the world was flat because it looks flat. And if it were round, we'd fall off. But this was not a new idea. He's also attributed, this achievement is attributed to him, that he's essentially the first white man to get into the Western Hemisphere. And that's not true either. And I am not talking, in this case, I'm not talking about the theory that there may have been Stone Age Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. We don't know that for a fact. I do not accept it for a fact, but we do know with absolute certainty that the Vikings, those raiding, blonde, blue-eyed kind of pirates from Scandinavia, made it over to North America and established a settlement that may have lasted for a generation or so. You can go to Newfoundland, Canada, and go to, actually there's nothing there but a lump of mud, but they make a big deal about how the Vikings were there. They left some artifacts there, but they did that in 985. And here's Columbus in 1492. 500 years earlier, the Vikings had made their way from Scandinavia to Iceland to Greenland to North America. But they left no record. It had been forgotten in Scandinavia too. So therefore, they have zero impact. At least I can tell you, Columbus is not the first person, the first European in the New World. He is also given credit for being the first person to cook up the idea that you give me some money, you give me some ships, and our objective is to get to the Far East. And what I'm going to do is, since this is the Far East, I'm not going to go this way. I'm not going to go east. I'm going to go west. Because I know the world is round. This is the only land mass on the world. When I make my way around the world, boom, I'll be where we need to go. He didn't invent that either. That was not a new notion. Other people had conceived of the same idea. So he didn't cook up anything new. He didn't originate a single idea. However, he's the first to make it happen. So here it is in a nutshell. You know what? This was the state-of-the-art map produced by all the knowledge of the Western world and the combined knowledge of humanity up to that point. The state-of-the-art map of 1489. This is produced by Europeans. This is all they knew about the world, as far to the extent of their knowledge. They had a rough notion about it, the size of Africa that's kind of fouled up. They had Europe, and this is all they'd taken a wild guess about the shape of Asia. And as far as they knew, those were the only inhabited land masses, and that's what Columbus believed. So his idea is to go west to hit the east. So here it is in a nutshell. This is the real world we know today. Columbus says, give me money, I'm going to go that way. He doesn't know there's a continent there. Give me your money, I'll take you where you want to go. I like this too because this shows you basically the European understanding of the globe at the time. This is their notion of of the west coast of Africa. Those are the Cape Verde Islands. There is the Iberian Peninsula, as far as they knew. See, that says Lisbena, that's Lisbon, Portugal. As far as Columbus knows, he's operating on the assumption that if he sails out 2,300 miles, boom, he'll hit that. And that was Japan. That's their word for Japan, Zipangu. And beyond that is the wealth of China, Cathay, where Marco Polo gained his experiences. And he's way off the mark. He doesn't know there's this landmass. He doesn't know Cathay is 12,000 miles away, not 2,000. So Spain put some money down on the worst deal in town. Is a wild guess, like throwing their money on a roulette wheel. And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like they hadn't invested that much. And when Columbus leaves, they probably didn't lose a minute's sleep. So here's the deal. He begins his voyage on August 3rd. He goes down to the Cape Verde Islands. He goes off the coast of Africa, where everybody knew that there were prevailing winds blowing to the west. So he really starts this voyage on September the 6th. September the 6th. You'll never need to know all these details. You'll never need to know those details again. It's not going to be a question that says Columbus left the African coast on, July the 4th. There's not going to be a question like that. He leaves on September the 6th, and away he goes. And they go 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 for 33 days. No, I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but this may have been the longest voyage by human beings without encountering land. Maybe in history, I don't know. Maybe Polynesians in ancient times had the same experience, but it's a voyage full of drama where the sailors are assumed they're going to die and they're going to float off the end of the earth, and they almost rebel, and it's practically a mutiny. Bottom line is they finally see some land, and they see it on the 33 and a half days. Boom! So that's October the 12th. And hundreds of years later, that became Columbus State. And he thought he was in Asia. This is a monumental picture inside the Capitol Dome of the United States of America. So Columbus claiming this land. He's an Italian, but he's an agent of Spain. He's claiming it for Spain. All the while he thought he was on the doorstep. He thought he was on one out of the islands laying off the coast of Japan, Zipangu. And he's within shouting distance of China. He is not. Where was he really? He's in the Bahamas. We can speculate about exactly what island he hit. But he found some stuff. He found a bunch of natives of kind of copper complexion. He found some exotic things. He took samples with him. He took some natives back with him. He left a bunch of some crew members there He goes back. They make their way safely back to Spain. He goes to the court and says, look what I got. It's proof that of something new and different. But he still thinks he's on the doorstep of Asia. He says, I have delivered to you. I promised to put you on the doorstep of the wealth of Asia, and here it is. And then he's financed for 3 more voyages. So he goes back and he goes back and he goes back, and exploring more and more areas around there. They find Cuba. They find today what we call Cuba. They find the Dominican Republic, all those things. At one point he touches on what we now call the isthmus that connects the north and the south, but he always thought he was still on the doorstep of Asia. And then they appoint him to be the governor of Cuba, and he screws that up, and he falls out of favor, and they put him in jail, and they send him back. And that's essentially, he disappears from the scene. But he had started something that made its way. The news made its way throughout Europe, and Spain picks up on the opportunities. I mean, Spain had already picked up on the opportunities. Other nations are going to start to attract attention to this. Spain will try to follow up on its advantage with sending up more expeditions, and it takes a long time. Look, Columbus does this thing in 1492. So this is 20 years later. By that time, there had been several expeditions. The expedition led by Balboa is the first to look around this area, walk across the isthmus, and then see a whole new sea beyond it, which he'll call the Pacific Ocean. It's not until 1522 that one ship under the flag of Spain sails all the way around the world, led by Ferdinand Magellan, who dies, and he's killed in the Philippines. Dies on the way, but they made it. Torn to pieces, but they made it. This proves that the world is a globe. This also increasingly proves that this wasn't Asia, but a brand new continent previously unknown to the Europeans. And then Columbus will die, and he dies at the age of 1506. And when he died, nobody knew and nobody cared. There's no celebration, no recognition, because what he'd done had not become a big deal yet. And to prove how anonymous he had become, eventually mapmakers are going to decide what to call this new landmass. And do they call it Columbia? No, they don't. They call it America. And they've got that name from the kind of minor explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, who was one of many Italians who participated in various voyages. He was not a captain. He hadn't done anything new. But he wrote a book about himself, an exciting journal about his exploits, and it made him the hero. And that was read, and that made him famous. And so one map maker, Martin Waldseemüller, is familiar with the name Amerigo. And he says, we'll call this this is the first map that bears that name. We'll call that new continent America. Boom, first time it appears. 1507, and that stuck. In the end, that term stuck. And so that's why we dwell on the Western Hemisphere in a continent known as North America. It could have been something else, but it turns out to be North America. So funny things happen. Still, whatever, you got to acknowledge that Columbus had unwittingly started a whole new phase in history that leads us kind of to the present. Once the European and the Western world, the old world had made contact with the new world, you couldn't break it apart again. As I say, a whole chain of events is going to be unleashed now, and it can't be reversed. And for a period of time, there was a new kind of game in town to create wealth and power. Conquest of native civilizations, exploiting them, establishing colonies to exploit resources, and to creating a global empire. Now, I'm almost done. I got to run. I'm almost done with this. Traditional changing views of Columbus. Columbus eventually did become famous. Of course he did. He became like a central figure known to school children because he had started a process, and that was finally understood when all of the repercussions of his voyage became apparent. So he's been famous for the past 300 plus years, 400 years. In all the history books and biographies written about him up until the past 50 or 60 years, he was always portrayed in a generally favorable way. It's all these things. A heroic figure, unstoppable, persevering, bringing Western civilization, overcoming every obstacle, all this stuff. an innovator. And if you read textbooks written in the 1950s, like this famous one, Samuel Eliot Morison of Harvard University, portray him in the most heroic light. But then all of this got busted up starting in the late 1960s, and I'm about to give the answer question. See this cover of Time magazine? By this time, what the events, revisionism had been underway for 20 to 30 years, but in the late 1980s, 1990s, Time magazine finally became hip to the fact that the kind of U.S. history being taught in schools had changed significantly, and now it was emphasizing the diversity of American society, the experience of oppressed minorities. The bottom line is the 1960s in the USA, there was the civil rights movement, there was the anti-war movement, there was a surge of criticism of America as a society for being involved in Vietnam, for its racist history, and a whole generation of historians, people going to graduate schools, began to focus on that. And I was part of that generation to a degree. And so when they look at Columbus, they came up with a whole different picture. He is not a hero, he's a bum. He's the world's greatest war criminal. And so I like this wanted poster because it shows you turning the heroic image upside down. And so a series of books began to come out, and this was especially highlighted in 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. See this? This says American Holocaust. That's not going to portray him as a hero. See, the Conquest of Paradise by Kirkpatrick Sale. All these things show him as a despicable person, and they're all going to emphasize these things. That Columbus's voyages started innumerable terrible events in human history. His voyage sparks the creation of the global slave trade that will involve the death of millions and the kidnapping of millions. His voyage results in what amounts to genocide, and practically the wiping out of native cultures, and the stripping down of the natural beauty of the Western Hemisphere, and all these things. Now, just to show you, this is, you know what, I'm going to show you about a 1-minute clip of CBS News on what must have been October the 12th, 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, or arrival in the New World. This is Dan Rather, the anchor of CBS News, and by that time a whole bunch of books had been written, a whole bunch of conferences had been held, and he's simply saying, today is the day that they're making a big deal about. And he's going to emphasize this multicultural approach. This little tiny segment here, why am I showing you a pleasure boat? Well, celebrations were held, celebrations or protests about this event were held all over the USA, depending on your point of view. For some reason in San Francisco, they held a parade, because San Francisco is full of a very self-proud Italian-American community. Some guy got dressed up as Columbus and was on this pleasure craft, and they were going to deliver him ashore to the applause of many, and there was an angry group of Native Americans there waiting to beat him up. So he decides to back off.
He was so unfriendly that Columbus just waved from way out beyond the breakwater and kept on sailing.
Maybe next year he might show up.
Native Americans decided this anniversary was time to remind the world this was their land before Columbus showed up.
He came to conquer us as a people, to enslave us as a people.
But those who traced their ancestors to Italy declared their pride in the first Italian to come this way.
We have a right to celebrate what is maybe the most important event of the last 700 years.
Along the parade route, there were many who crossed other oceans to get here. In a changing America, there are those who say it's time for the nation to rethink the way it remembers its past. That rethinking is already taking place in many classrooms.
We're trying to get the idea across that he was an evil, greedy, bloodthirsty person.
Okay, see, I love that. I love that. And I don't know what you were taught, or if you were taught anything about this stuff in the local schools here. I really don't know. that represented the full-blown power of multicultural curriculum in the 1990s. Now, that generated in America a huge backlash by political conservatives who said, people like Rush Limbaugh said, the commies have taken over our schools and are lying to our children and turning them into anti-Americans. And that was widely believed then and still is by many people.
That's Columbus as depicted in many textbooks today.
People never talked about the Indians' perspectives.
The point isn't to destroy Columbus, but to tell America's story from more than just a European point of view.
Columbus Day should be a day of thinking, not only celebrating, but thinking of what really happened that day.
What really happened this day 500 years ago was the inevitable meeting of the New and Old Worlds, and the beginning of all the bad and all the good that has followed. John Blackstone, CBS News, San Francisco.
And that's part of our world, part of our history tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Well, that was a picture of Dan Rather, who used to be the longtime anchorman on CBS News, and that was, hey, 22 years ago. That's older than most of the people in this room. You know what? I don't care whether Columbus was a good guy or a bad guy. It's irrelevant, ultimately. These things did happen, but my point of view is they would have happened inevitably. Europe was producing a whole bunch of people. Europe was in a position, there were certain nations with the motivation to find new ways to make money, and there was going to be contact between the old world and the so-called new world inevitably. And when that contact took place, there was going to be incredible consequence, and that's what happened. He is the first to make it happen. There's no question about that. And he did start something new, something he never came to appreciate himself. Now, let's go. The initial discoveries are followed up by more and more exploration. Then there'll be a period of incredible conquest. And I have to say this very, very quickly. Two in particular, the two still remaining vital Native American civilizations down in Latin America were just taken over. One's going to be the conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés, and so the Aztecs have their power right here. And to make a long story as short as I possibly can, Cortés will take a force of, he'll get 7 ships, 550 men. He managed to wrangle and cheat his way into being the leader of this expedition. By 1519, the Spaniards had heard about the wealth of some fancy civilization in the interior of Mexico. I don't know when they began to use that term, but they launched an expedition. It's only 550 men. And they are also carrying with them some horses, some very small light cannon, and some big attack dogs that were used at the time. And the bottom line is those guys will land in 1592. They'll encounter Aztec dignitaries who try to buy them off. They'll give them some women as concubines and so forth. But they'll keep pursuing it. They'll wind up in Tenochtitlan. There they will almost be wiped out. But they'll manage to bring down that empire. They'll come back and they'll bring down that empire. And the Spanish will have seized and put themselves on top of an incredibly complex and wealthy society. And then this is followed up sometime later by Francisco Pizarro. This guy's illiterate. These are from the kind of the lower middle classes of Spanish society. He will, as a kind of adventurer and representative, an agent of the king of the Spanish crown, he'll hear about some wealth down there in deep South America, and he will, after several forays, he'll take a group of 168 guys. That's all, and they will move gradually into the Inca Empire and take it over and take it down. 168, 550 and 168, 550 to 20 million, 168 to 8 million. How did that possibly happen? These are the most incredible conquests in history. Well, how can so few conquer so many? Let me just say very quickly. Here comes the answer to a question. I've given you some explanations and some information about the weaknesses, the unknown weaknesses in Native American society. Now I'm going to give you the information that will enable you to answer a question on the exam. And it's going to be a double-answered question. Now, I've already talked about how could so few conquer so many? What are some things I've told you? What are some possible explanations?
Since Indians weren't so advanced in their civilization as the
You're implying technology in a way. And any other reason? The disease factor is going to be critical. Anything else I said? Well, let's roll down the list and see what's most plausible. Now, what you could attribute this to the fact that the native, the Aztecs and the Inca were still Stone Age civilizations, and there's an element of truth to that. Well, I mean, it's beyond an element of truth. The Europeans had some fancy weaponry for the time, but let's just consider what they had. They had steel swords, they had daggers, they had lances, they had arquebuses, which is like a primitive musket. They had some small cannon. They were wearing chain mail and steel helmets. Meanwhile, what do the Indians have? Well, they've got stone and wooden clubs with obsidian blades. They got hand axes. They got slingshots. They got quilted armor. That's all they got. I have always felt, and I'm going to tell you, this is the answer to the question, whether it's right or not. This is the answer to a question on the exam. The technological advantage did not seem to me to be critical, not at all. Oh, there are just a very small number of these guys, and the Aztecs could field 20,000, 30,000 men. An Aztec axe or mace could cut a man in half. These people were highly disciplined, accustomed to fighting, accustomed to following orders to the point of death. Those Aztec warriors or the Inca warriors could have overwhelmed those Spaniards. But it's not hard to hurt a horse. Yes, when you see a man on a horse and you've never seen a horse before, it's very frightening. And if you've ever been ridden down by a policeman on horseback, you'll see what a disadvantage you have. But it's not hard to hurt a horse. And those axes could tear people to pieces. That cannot be a critical advantage. Now, I've also read that in the process of capturing Pizarro, defeating in his first confrontation with Incas, that those 168 may have killed 5,000 in one afternoon, and that would have made their arms very tired. I don't see how they did it. Yes.
So there is no inaccuracy in the numbers.
Oh, there are huge inaccuracies. That figures this number right. This is a reliable number. That number's not. That's kind of a wild guess. But we know it's millions. This is kind of a general agreement. It's in the range of 20 mil total. So that's not your answer. Now, it's also been conjectured that the Inca and the Aztec and the Maya had religious beliefs that did involve like the return of a vanquished god who was bringing back wrath to destroy the society. And in the case of the Europeans, they kind of fit the description. The Aztecs had the legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and they kind of looked that way. White skin, bearded faces coming in on ships that looked like big birds. I don't believe that that's key either. When the Aztecs and the Inca quickly found out these guys were dirty, stinking, horny men who could be killed. I don't believe they were gods. So this becomes the critical stuff. The bottom line is that the Spaniards were able to very skillfully exploit internal divisions. And in the case of Cortez, I told you that the Aztecs had created an empire based on force. They were hated. Cortez famously takes advantage of a concubine who was given to him named Malintzin, an Aztec woman. Malintzin, she came to be called La Malinche. She became his mistress. She had a child by him, arguably the very first mestizo child. Therefore, she is the mother of Mexico, La Madre de Mexico. She's also the betrayer of Mexico because she hated the Aztecs and gave all this information to him about how to exploit their interior, their differences. And so when he's defeated and kicked out of Mexico City or Tenochtitlan, he comes back with thousands of Indian allies. They were eager to defeat the Aztec. And the same is going to be Well, the same is going to be true of Pizarro. He managed to see, Cortez seizes Moctezuma, the Aztec leader, and eventually sees that he's killed. Pizarro managed to seize and hold for ransom and then kill the Inca leader, and Pizarro had walked into a civil war, a full-blown civil war. He's able to exploit it. That's critical. And then the disease is the big deal. The disease is the big deal. Pizarro walked in a situation where the Aztecs were already going to die. Their emperor, Atahualpa, had already died of exposure to smallpox. So and what I'm telling you is the leadership structure of these places began to crumble very quickly as they all began to die. And when all your people are dying, they're not. You got to figure God's on their side. The principal thing you're going to die from is smallpox, and that's what it looks like, ladies and gentlemen. That's what smallpox does to you. It will eventually create these little pustules that become hard, bleed, ooze, become hard, and it'll split the skin, and you'll die of shock. Quite a way to go. Now you could ask yourself why diseases like smallpox, whooping cough, measles, all these things, they developed here, and the Europeans had immunity to them, but these folks had none. And the simple truth is that in this area here, there were not a bunch of domesticated animals. And in the history of the old world, Asia, Africa, and Europe, there were many, many domesticated animals. Cattle are the basis of these pox diseases. Cattle connected to tuberculosis, pigs and ducks, and so forth. Many of these animals were absent. So just take a look how many people died. The Aztec population goes from 20 mil to 1.2 million over a period of time. Now, I still haven't got where I need to go. I'm in considerable trouble. So you're going to see me go very quickly. Let me just at least get to this. After these conquests take place, you're going to see the creation of vast global empires. You need to know what they were. You need to know what was Portuguese territory and what was not. And I'll simply say that as early as 1492, the reigning pope did not want the two Catholic nations to fight. He said, "Come to me. I'm drawing a line, imaginary line, the Treaty of Tordesillas, down this line, and everything to the west of the line that may be found will belong to Spain, and everything to the east of the line that may be found will belong to Portugal," and those two nations basically abided by that. Spain sets about to create a massive empire. They happen to encounter all the good stuff. They will also eventually make their way and establish control over the Philippines. Meanwhile, the Portuguese will establish their empire in what they eventually will be called Brazil, and that's why the Brazilians speak Portuguese and not Spanish. They'll establish little fortresses and trading posts along this coast. They'll get into India and establish a trading post there. They'll get into Indonesia. And let me just go ahead and say this before, because I know we're just about out. But when the old world and the new world come together, you got a bunch of things happening. Europe suddenly becomes the center of everything. A bunch of wealth will flow into Europe. The wealth is going to be simply extracted, very often extracted mineral wealth, especially silver, will come into Europe. It'll increase the money supply by 800%. So this is a period of price inflation in the 1500s, which when prices go up, it makes tremendous wealth for the merchants and the government, because wages don't go up as quickly. So it's a period of wealth making for Europe that leads Europe ahead of the rest of the world and will lead to the Industrial Revolution. A bunch of industries, global industries that never existed, now tie the world together. Huge amounts of gold taken out of the Western Hemisphere and transported over to Europe. Sugarcane will be taken out of the old world and brought into the new world, and sugarcane production will become huge. So will tobacco. And then slaves will have to be brought out to work those fields and plantations as the native population dies off. Huge consequences. You have one group of people die off in enormous numbers, the greatest die off in history. You'll have migrations of hundreds of thousands of Caucasians, Spaniards in particular, Portuguese. They will mix with the local population and create brand new peoples. You'll have mestizos who are part European and part Indian. You'll have mulattoes who are part European and part African, and you'll have every combination thereof. That's part of the New World. Last time I saw you, I was racing through, in an incredibly superficial way, all these extraordinary things that happened pretty quickly after Columbus, representing the leading edge of Europe, the old world, bumped into the Western Hemisphere. It just, in one century, in the century of the 1500s, that's the 16th century, it transformed the history of humanity. Big impact on Europe as now the center of power and wealth, absorbing wealth from the Western Hemisphere. New global industries that involve ultimately countless millions of people and untold trillions of dollars by our standards today. Huge shifts in the distribution of the human species. It's just unbelievable. And you know what? Everybody in this room is a product of that event, even though you may well not be aware of it. So that's part of the picture. Then I had end there. Now to say this, and there'll be questions connected to this. When the old world began to not only made initial contact, but then had profound impact with the establishment of colonial empires, the migration of thousands and thousands of people, and bringing with them all their stuff. That contact created essentially one global community. I'm sure people didn't understand it. They had no idea what was being unleashed, but that's what happened. And over the course of the 1600s, there was an incredibly complicated transfer of plant life and animal life and disease life from the old world to the new world, from the new world to the old world. That's known as the Columbian Exchange. And here's just a quick snapshot of it. You'll need to know some of these things. There were countless things, aspects, plant life, animal life, biological, like bacteria, present in this environment that had evolved over 100,000 years, at least 15,000 years, not present here. So here's the first emphasis. From the old world, what was brand new brought to the new world. Never before experienced. Well, in terms of animals, it's a huge exchange. Yes, the new world, the Western Hemisphere had no horses. And now they're going to have them by the millions. And they'll become the basis of native civilizations and whole industries like ranching. The American and Latin American traditions of ranching. Goats were not present and are brought in. Sheep were not present. They are brought into the Western Hemisphere. No kind of cattle, no kind of bovine animal was present in the Western Hemisphere. It's incredible. Even pigs, something as common as the pig, did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. The closest thing to it is a javelina, which is a nasty, almost like rat-like thing you find in Arizona. A hairy rat, a big hairy rat. But not the pig, not the puerco. Even the wild pigs, the wild boars that are being shot by people are descendants of these brought in by the Europeans, the Spaniards in particular. Plant life, there are many, many things to mention, but I'll just concentrate on a few. The European version of wheat was a grain not known in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't present. So wheat is introduced, which is wheat, Western European civilization was a bread-based civilization, so they bring their grains with them. Bananas weren't present, among many other things. That's an African plant brought into the Western Hemisphere and tropical areas, becomes a big product eventually, not immediately. Sugarcane was very quickly big. Columbus brought sugarcane. That too is like originates in the old world, in tropical climate. He brought sugarcane to the Western Hemisphere, and that's going to be the basis of that's going to be the reason there's going to be a massive slave trade more than anything else. The labor to create sugar, the presence of massive amounts of sugarcane make possible sugar sweetening for the rest of the world in some sense. Even coffee was not present. And coffee is an African product and eventually became a huge money maker in various parts of Latin America in particular, and many, many other things on top of that, such as this. Too many things. Even onions were not present. Cebollas weren't there. Grapes, no kind of citrus product was native to the Western Hemisphere. You don't have to write down all those things. I want you to concentrate on these. These. You'll need to memorize them. Flat out memorization. Memorization is good. It's a brain activity. Ever know funny little things like no crabgrass, no dandelions? Those came from Europe. And diseases, Europe, because of the presence of all those domesticated animals from which human beings acquired many diseases, most of the pox diseases come from cattle. The Europeans brought in an immense number of diseases that had not been there. Smallpox was always the biggest killer to a population with no immunities. But even malaria was not present in the Western Hemisphere, supposedly prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And that's an extraordinary thing because malaria became a big, big killer. It became endemic and then it's never gone away. Gonorrhea, to talk about sexually transmitted diseases. Now, here's the switch. Things that the native populations developed over thousands of years that had never been seen elsewhere. Okay, in terms of animals, not too much. Really, I took the llama or the alpaca is the kind of beast of burden. They domesticated that in the Andes. That's not an animal associated with Mexico. It's associated with the Andes. And, it carries some stuff. I told you how I think it's a nasty, dirty little dog-like creature that projectile vomits and stuff. But it wasn't a big hit. It's not a great contribution to civilization, in my opinion. The turkey, other than that, not too much to comment about. A main source of protein, the Americas had all kinds of fowl, birds of every description. Yeah, lots of them. But not too many domesticated animals. The buffalo is a bovine animal that was present in the Western Hemisphere. And I'll tell you what, it's hard to tame a buffalo. It's hard to get a buffalo to ride. Let him ride you. Other than that, this is about all they had. In terms of plants, the Western Hemisphere made huge contributions to the rest of humanity. Corn is huge. Maize is probably the basis of 2 billion people's diet today, directly or indirectly, probably 3 billion. Potatoes were unknown, and they're brought in to Western Europe. First, they were resisting. The potato, because from the nightshade family, is actually poisonous, but they found a way to... The ancient Indians found a way to breed it so that it was edible and very nutritious. You know what? Things you're very familiar with. Tomatoes. The tomate was not known anywhere else until the Europeans found it and brought it back to Europe. Tobacco was a native product, and it very quickly spread throughout the world in the 1600s and the 1700s as an addictive substance that people love. It's a stimulant. Cacao is native. The Aztecs, drank chocolate drinks. It's still part of Mexican cuisine. Mole. Chile, every kind of chile, every kind of plant that evolves from the chile was native to the Western Hemisphere and not known anywhere else. And now you can see how various cuisines all over the world, from Sichuan cooking in China that involves a bunch of chili, to the chili-based spicy foods of India, to the chili-based spicy foods of Indonesia and Korea, and on and on and on. Didn't have any of that until this connection between the two different worlds. Squash, a whole bunch of different kinds of beans. Even Mr. Peanut was native to, the cacahuate was native to the Western Hemisphere and not known. So was anywhere else. The pineapple, the rubber plant, many, many things. Diseases, apparently the only one that went the other way was syphilis. The most virulent kind of venereal disease. I will not ask that question on the exam. Now, what happened to Spain? Spain almost blundered into a massive empire. Their portion of the Western Hemisphere included the most advanced civilizations. They plundered them and turned it into at least temporary power in the 1500s in Europe. They tried to take that empire and translate it into global domination. Spain did. That's why there's a thing by the late 1500s, the 1580s, Spain made a play to actually invade England in order to restore Catholicism. They lost. The Spanish Armada was blown to smithereens. Bottom line is that Spain did not convert its wealth, its colonial empire's wealth, into permanent wealth. Spain did not become one of the leading nations of Europe heading into modernity. They didn't take that wealth and turn it into homegrown, self-producing wealth in Spain. They did not. And that's why Spain has been, since the 1800s, one of the weaker nations of Europe. And today, among the members of the European Union, it's still one of the weakest, with a 25% unemployment rate. They tried to establish a monopoly and keep everybody else out. They couldn't. And this is becoming clear by the late 1500s. Other nations began to want to get in there because they saw Spain's example. They found the good stuff. It made them wealthy and powerful. Maybe there's more good stuff. Let's go get it too. So the nations that could, Britain, France, Holland in particular, they start to probe around areas where the Spanish did not have an enforceable claim. They didn't have the muscle to keep it going. The rest of this area of Spain more or less did have the muscle. And so now we're finally moving slowly towards the founding of the germ of the United States.